Hello, everyone. I am Kristian Roberts, Director of Education at the Dallas Opera. I'm here with my fabulous friend and co-host,
Quo Johnson, Education and Company Culture Manager for the Dallas Opera.
and of course, we're back this week with another episode of Taking the Stage with Kristian
and Quo.
So today we have a fantastic guest. Thank you all for tuning in. I always say that our guests are fabulous. But I want to go ahead and, Quo, why don't you go ahead and talk to us about our guest today, because I think she's absolutely fantastic.
Absolutely. So our guest today is the lovely Diane Hosey, who has been such a monumental presence, passion, support, leader in so much of the necessary work that is taking place here in Dallas and throughout actually the entire nation. It's national and international at this point. And so she is very heavy, very active in social justice as well as philanthropy. And so we wanted to provide an opportunity to have a wonderful conversation with her just to see what that looked like and what that intersection is, as well as ways that we can go about joining in that work, supporting that work within our own roles, within our organizations, and as individuals within our community. And so, of course, before we have Diane kind of share about herself, we always want to give a shout out to TDO. Thank you, Dallas Opera, for allowing us to have this platform. Shout out to David. Hey, David. Always. As well as one of the things we started doing with this show is making sure that we take the time, that we take the moment to do a land and people acknowledgement. This is something that I often do as a facilitator for any of the workshops or any of the sessions that I facilitate. So we wanted to make sure that we incorporate that in the shows as well. So I ask that everyone who's watching join me in taking this moment to acknowledge that we are all on stolen land. Here in Dallas, we are on stolen land. This land was already inhabited, cultivated by sovereign nations that were here before they were forcefully removed. Here in Dallas, in this part of Dallas, we are on the land of the Comanche, of the Caddo, and of the Wichita. And these are all sovereign nations. And so in other locations, of course, there are other sovereign nations that were forcefully removed just being in this United States. So we want to take the time to acknowledge that, and then to acknowledge that individuals were stolen from their home and brought here and enslaved. And through that free and forced labor, we have what we now enjoy as the United States for us here in Dallas. So I take this time to acknowledge this because this is part of the step of healing for us. This is part of the step for correcting issues that we've inherited. And to also acknowledge that while we've inherited these things, this is also the opportunity for us to come together so that we can correct the issues, so that we can reduce harm, so that we can move together, so that we're greater in connection, and so that we're greater in co-collaboration, especially in the arts, of course, but in everything that we do. And so that is our land and people acknowledgement for this episode. And without further ado, I'm going to have Diane kind of tell us a bit about herself.
All right. Well, first, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm all duded up. I mean, I actually did my hair and put some makeup on. I was like, yeah, I remember doing this. And I just want to thank you for honoring, doing the land acknowledgement. And as you said that, I looked behind me, the blanket that is behind me is from the American, it was a gift presented to us from the American Indian College, and we had granted them a multi-year grant for a women's leadership group that there were representative students, women students who met from each of the different tribes that participated, and they created their own collective and learned from one another. And it was a fabulous experience. And so this was one of the lovely gifts. It was the Corn Princess Festival. So thank you for doing that.
Right.
This is what I do. I tend to just start talking, even though you asked me a particular question, which was we're not really into titles here. We decided to do away with those because we are a women-centric, small, 3-staff family foundation, and through some of our strategic conversations, we said, you know what, we're not really built on patriarchy. Let's get rid of some of those patriarchal ways of referring to one another, and titles are one of those. So we just sort of said, well, what are you responsible for? And I just took a big brushstroke and said, oh, philanthropic outreach. You know, so everything can fall into that, right?
Yes, yes.
So that's the area that I kind of focus in on. But if you want to look at it's more operational in nature, it is more the relational side of the foundation as far as grant making and learning about what's happening in the community, having community awareness sessions and conversations where we can learn about what's happening and what's important to our community. So that's what I'm up to.
Fantastic. That's really interesting. I did not know that, so I learned something today. Just about the foundation, because I was actually gonna, at the beginning of this, like we started telling people to introduce themselves, and so I'm glad that you explained all of that. I think that's very, very cool. So I just want to talk a little bit. You just talked a little bit about your work and what you do and how that can pretty much encompass everything, particularly when you're working with the community and listening to the needs of the community. What started you on the path to philanthropy?
It was through the connections to Gail Embrey and through Lauren Embrey. So it really, I think highlights a lot of, which we can speak more about this, to connections that are made and through relationship building, how a lot of opportunities are made available that way. But it almost seems like there's this, particularly in philanthropy, this underground way of navigating. And if you're a family foundation, you usually have, you may have staff, but the board is all made up of usually family members and maybe a few people from outside of the family, but they usually have connections to the family. And in my previous life, before coming here, I just celebrated my 10-year anniversary with the foundation. Yay! I had my own consulting practice for 10 years. And then before that was in a small consulting firm. And then before that, I did training and development in the corporate world. So what really led me into this was that I had a great interest in women in leadership and developing women in leadership. And what developed into one of my core competencies as far as offerings was women's affinity groups, where women could come together and had a format that they could bring issues to the table and talk about, and tried to make those, diverse in nature. And then just the development, the core skills and development for women that were in leadership, that were aspiring into leadership. And I remember, and I launched a lot of this with my core client, which was Nokia, a Finnish company. And they were like, they had established their North American presence in Irving, and they were very concerned that this would be illegal. We cannot have things for women. I know about the EEOC. So I was like, no, it's perfectly okay, because everything you do is around men. Nokia, actually, Finland is a country that really has a lot of gender equity across the board. But so through that work, I really found that was the thing that energized me the most. And I wanted to continue to hone those skills. So I did. And then in the meantime, I was in a group called Art Spirit. And it was a group that was started by a woman, a former pastor, who was a dancer. And she knew that artists very often are solo practitioners. And even if they're involved in larger performance-based groups, they're not big churchgoers, or in the sense of participating in some of those traditional ways of practicing spirituality. So she decided to create kind of a mission group, so to speak, in Dallas. And because I knew her and I had a theater background, she said I could participate. And through that group, I met Gail Embrey, and through Gail Embrey, I met Lauren Embrey. And that's how I met my husband too.
Look at that.
And he was not an artist per se. I think he was probably, looking for dates. I don't know. But
he looked for a date and found a wife. Nothing wrong with that.
Artistic soul about him, and he certainly has his own visual art practitioner. So that's how I met those two. And here's another kind of leadership, women in leadership thing that I would share is, because I did a lot of coaching with women executives and women in leadership, is if there's something you want, then prepare yourself and go ask for it.
Yep.
And I knew I was ready to transition out of my consulting practice. And I mean, I was, was there when the market downturned. And at the same time, I was like, man, I'm tired of this travel. I was doing a lot of international travel as well as local, suit up and show up. And so I started having conversations started with Gail and then with Lauren. And I knew that they were launching something big at the foundation that was going to have a lot of focus on women in particular. So I created a presentation and I said, I want to change lanes. I want to change highways. And I want to find a place with you all. And if it's not now, I just want to make myself, heard and available for that. Mm-hmm. And I swear within months it happened.
That's really cool.
And that,
well,
I had no philanthropic experience. I'd been on several boards of nonprofits, but I just talked my way into it.
But you know what? I think there's merit to that, because you didn't have to come in with any preconceived ideas and stuff. You kind of could, go in and just say, well, why can't we do it that way? I think there's merit to that.
Merit.
You could go in and question things.
To not having to follow those kind of standard business practices.
Yes.
With that.
So no, I think that's cool. And the other thing she did, you noticed she had a name it and claim it moment.
Yeah.
She was like I want to go and do this, and here's the presentation, and the next thing you know, and she's able to claim it. So that's phenomenal. That's a great story. And I think that there are a lot of people who would be very interested in that pathway, because it's not the traditional way, but if we can't do anything, we can buck tradition sometime. Let's do it. So it's interesting because in thinking about that, I'm kind of curious because, again, you didn't go through the pathway for philanthropy, the one that we would normally associate with, doing philanthropic work. So I want to ask, what does philanthropy mean to you?
I can tell you that evolved over time for sure. I had to, when I did my research, I was like looking up traditional definitions of philanthropy, which actually the root, and I'm sure you've heard this, is love of man, love of mankind. And it is basically my personal viewpoint of philanthropy is that it is owed to the people where the money was made. It is a trust, and it is a trust that when an organization says or declares that instead of their wealth transitioning into taxes that get paid to the government, that they are parlaying those dollars into a trust, into a foundation, and that they commit to grant that money out into the world. Now, a family foundation has a lot of more flexibility than a public foundation. Mm-hmm. And they certainly have a lot more stringent guidelines and et cetera. But for us, it has really been a way of stretching boundaries across the board and understanding that, I guess too much who is given, much is expected, and to really understand what your role is, what your role needs to be. And when I first started, it was very traditional in some ways. And part of that is because when Lauren started the foundation, actually Gail started it, and then Lauren came in to be the president, and Gail was the vice president. And then they had taken someone from the Embrey interest side, the business side, and asked her to help be the administrator. So they went and took all the classes that everybody else takes, and basically said, oh my God, we need to have guidelines, we need to have a mission statement, we need to have all these things. And they did all of that, which you do need to have. Those are good things to have. But eventually, there was some questioning about, well, why do we have to do things this way? And one of the things, and this happened with the help of a good consultant who actually worked with a lot of foundations, women's foundations, like the Dallas Women's Foundation and others. And they knew, she helped Gail and Lauren figure out that they wanted to have, where would be the pillars of focus? And, I'll name those there in a minute. But as we went along, what we came to understand, and you probably know about this now, is that a lot of foundations will stick to the guidelines of the IRS says that you must give out at least 5% of your corpus, of your of the monies that you have allocated, 5% every year. And I would say only 5%. You only have to give 5% according to the IRS. Well, that's nonsense. And one of the things that through our conversations, and when I first started, they launched this initiative, and it was called Mission Without Borders, is what they ended up naming it. And they said, this is going to be a 5-year, $15 million initiative. And I can tell you that very few of the grants we gave during that period of time were at that 5% threshold. We were giving out per year 19 to 21%. And granting those dollars out into the work. And so I bring that up because one time I asked a friend of mine who's in philanthropy, and I said, help me to understand why so many of these smaller foundations and even some mid-sized ones, they all seem to kind of just walk lockstep in what they're doing and how they're doing it. And she said, that's simple. They all use the same attorneys to put together their foundation. So they give them the same, templates and the same guidelines. At least that's what I was told at that point in time. And so, even when I first came on board, it's because of sort of the leadership and the courage and the boldness that Gail and Lauren both had, which was, we don't want to do things the traditional way. We want to go big and bold, and we want to see what will happen. And so that's kind of that's a roundabout way to answer your question. But I think it's real important to think about, why you are here and what you are meant to do. Otherwise, you probably don't need to form a foundation.
Well, you got the next question? She said a whole word. That was a whole sermon right there. That, whew.
Thank you for sharing and for that last point, why you're here. And then even in considering the history of wealth in this nation and the accumulation of wealth and what that means and who it truly belongs to and how we go through the process of correcting that harm. So yeah, absolutely. It's what are you here? What are you supposed to be doing? What should you be doing? What can you do? And even in that, I can hear and expect and anticipate some saying, well, that's not, it's 5%. That's not, you're that business model that you're using does not fit well with what we need to do. But it is truly a matter of what is the purpose and what are you helping to create or support? Because I can speak from personal experience, the support, the work, the commitment coming from the Embrey Family Foundation has been exponential in the ways in which the ways in which Dallas has been impacted, the way that so many other organizations have been impacted, because there's a true commitment there, not so much to follow guidelines, but to follow truth. And so I share that with others as we're kind of starting again to buck against the lack of tradition and the lack of traditional ways of approaching things. So thank you for that. I'd like to kind of ask about some of the additional work that you've been doing. So you spoke about the social work, especially the work in making sure that we get gender equity and in fighting for women and making sure that women leaders have platforms, have support, because it's absolutely important. Can you also speak to the work that you're doing for racial equity, which is, I believe, how we first met in
Yes,
Yes.
yes,
the sessions that Embrey Family Foundation supported or was hosting?
yes, I'm happy to do that. Well, I would say also where we're at now is we were national in scope, and we have become very place-based. So our focus is very much focused on Dallas and Texas. So we're also, when it comes to women in leadership, very interested in supporting Black women leaders in their capacities, and through some, political parity work. We haven't necessarily shied away from that, and and all of this is an evolution, which I think is really important for one of the things that I would really like to convey. It's been my learning journey. It's been all of our learning journey here at the foundation. And the same thing can be said from learning about racial equity and racial justice work. It never ends. There is, you think you are at a certain point and something happens, and I can tell you this happened to me just a couple of weeks ago, where I got yanked back. I was like, you think you that woke, you are not really that woke in that moment. And I stepped right into it. So there's always a reminder that you have to stay in it. You have to stay aware. You have to listen tremendously, and you have to do the work of really understanding where people are at and what is happening. Never make assumptions, et cetera, about that. So one of the deals was in the 5-year initiative, and I think when I started the foundation, gosh, Sally's going to correct me on this, but I think we're at about 46 million as far as the corpus of the foundation when I started. That is, by Dallas standards, not that big. That's a lot of money. We don't, you can sneeze at that. It's nothing to sneeze at. But by some Dallas standards, that is, not huge. And so when the idea of going big and bold came forward, we knew that if we continued the way we were going, we were going to put ourselves out of business. So that became one of the questions about, do we want to do that? Because a lot of foundations will just go into perpetuity if they want. Or in a family foundation, they'll have different family members that will come on board. Sometimes they'll take roles in the foundation, at least participate on the board, and they'll just keep going. And if you only give out 5%, you can do that for a long time. So conversations had to be had with Lauren's two sons about whether they wanted to come on board, whether they wanted to take on this work. And through a lot of discussions, they said, we love everything you're doing, but this isn't necessarily for us. And they will become their own philanthropists, unto themselves. So when that happened, we really had to say, all right, if we're going to blow all that money, we're going to spend it down, as they say, or sunset the organization. What are the heightened priorities to really look at? And we had, in the original model, gender and racial equity were really parts of the same funding strategy under that particular pillar. And when we looked at what we were doing around the gender equity, we felt pretty good. But when we looked around what we were doing with the racial equity, there was work to be done there. So that's when, and Lauren had a connection with Race Forward, and the president at the time, Rinku Sen, who had done some training with either the Women's Donor Network or Women Moving Millions, one of those. And she took them through some exercises on implicit bias and, the whole implicit bias test and all of that. And it was really an awakening for Lauren. And so she just decided, I think this is important for us to do this work and understand, what it is, and then take it forward and try to invite other folks to do that. So it was through that evolution and through that learning process that racial equity and, really now kind of more on the racial justice side got heightened. And we decided to really hone in on Dallas because Dallas is where the family was. They're long-term Texans as well. Goes back through the generations. And Lauren has been very honest about her own personal experience with housekeeper and her husband who raised them when they were young children, helped raise them, obviously, when they were young children. A lot of things she did not understand at the time, and later as she got older, she started questioning and wondering about. And so in that way, she was very transparent that, there are things that absolutely we as white people with our supremacy and our privilege just don't get unless we work really hard at it. So that's kind of started our own journey, and we just kept expanding from there. We started Dallas Faces Race, and we started that with the Boone Family Foundation, and really the goal behind that was we wanted to build capacity in the community of Dallas to prepare for the Facing Race Conference, which Race Forward put on every 2 years, a biannual conference. And I will say personally, that was a big aha for me. The first Facing Race Conference I went to was in Chicago, and they always have it in November, during an election cycle. And my husband, who's from outside of Chicago, went with me. He didn't go to the conference. And I'm telling you, I was so over my head. I was so over my head and my purview of experience. And I went to a session with other funders that had been funding racial justice or racial equity work. I mean, some big players were in the room for this training session. I think I was the lone representative from our foundation, and I was the smallest as far as foundations in that room. And I'm listening to this talk, and I was like, I do not know what they're talking about. I don't understand the vocabulary. I don't understand the language. So I just, faked it and, didn't say much. I just listened, which I think is a key learning for all of, white folks that are in, just in general and certainly in the philanthropy world, is to listen. And I told my husband, I went to some of these sessions, the Facing Race Conference, and I was like, I try to present myself as, having some savvy, I'm a good progressive, I came up in the 60s, early 70s, that kind of stuff. And I'd be sitting in some of these groups and they would look at me like, yeah, they knew it. Yeah. So, and it was intimidating, and it really caused me to, I said to him, who do I think I am here? And so, I came back, and we really wanted to do a grant with Race Forward, and it was one that was actually put together to scan the media for language that was, racially insensitive or charged language or what have you, and how it would get printed and then multiplied across, different media sectors. And we put that grant together with them and presented it to the board, and they just totally didn't get it. And why? We hadn't prepared them for anything like this.
Yeah.
And it was probably one of the few grants that did not get approved since I had been with the foundation and after. And Lauren was like, that's okay. We're going to come back to it in a whole different way. And we came back to it through Dallas Faces Race.
Yes.
So we came back to it in a much bigger, a much holistic way. And again, the reason was that the root cause for a lot of the things that we were talking to grantees about, if you kept peeling the onion, the thing that nobody wanted to talk about was there was racism embedded in the system. Any system you were looking at. All of these things that people, educational issues, economic issues, onward it goes. But the thing that nobody really wanted to, was really talking very specific about was the systemic racism. And so we did a lot of learning around that with Race Forward, who became our national partner. We brought them in to do trainings with the community here in Dallas, with the nonprofit communities. We wanted to stay in that lane, since that's the lane that we drove down in. There was no commitment to that from we funded all of that work, all of those trainings, all that awareness building. And the only thing we asked people was to take what they were learning and apply it to their own organizations. Mm-hmm. And it all started, I've listened to some of the other things that y'all talked about with vocabulary. Mm-hmm. What does this mean? Because they taught us that if you don't have a common vocabulary amongst all the people that you're working with, they're going to be lost, and there'll be debate, about what this is and what it means, and let's twist it this way. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you, the first few times that we, like they put up on a slide, white supremacy. Mm-hmm. People would really tense up. Mm. And this was in, like, we started in 2012. We went, really got very busy with it in 2013. And then the conference was in 2014. And we thought that would be the end of it. We thought, we're going to bring this conference here. These people, these organizations, are going to move into this with a lot more knowledge they had. We helped fund them to go to the conference. And afterwards, and then of course, people would come to these convenings and they say, so I guess you're going to drop out now, because that's what all funders do when it comes to this kind of work. And we're like, okay.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, that's hard for us, because as a small family foundation, we are, Lauren very much likes to start things, but she's not big on finishing them. She wants someone else. She's like, let's start it, let's launch it, and let's get people interested in it. And then let's move on to, something else, because she's a pretty, entrepreneurial kind of person in that way. And she's the leader. So the leader influences a lot about how you do it. And we knew we just couldn't walk away from it. There was just no way, because we barely started, peeling the onion on a lot of what was happening in Dallas. So that's what started us on the path. And we just kept going.
It's such an interesting tale. And I think that some of the things that stuck out to me is where you talked about how it's been an evolving thing, and how you've learned so many things along the way, and how I also hear a humility that happens when you're like, whoa, wait a minute. I had no idea this was going on. And then how even in doing that, you knew this, even though Lauren had a way of doing things, you all knew that you had to keep going with this thing. You couldn't start it and have people come in and continue to work. Like, you knew you had to stay in it because it was a different thing. And I think people fail to recognize that this is a consistent type of work that needs to happen. So I have to say hats off to you for that, because for you to be able to recognize that this time was different. This was different. Something was different about this, and understand the importance of it. I think that's huge. And I think it shows an awareness as an organization that I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how they can have in their organization. And I think that I'm not sure what I want to ask next, because I have so many questions, but because you've talked about.
One thing I want to share with you all, I mean, this is an arts podcast. Our focus was on arts as social justice, and how racial equity and racial justice plays into the arts, and how the arts can be utilized to, as not just a tool, but a way of shifting culture, particularly in these ways. So the Boone Family Foundation had a much more heavily focused on racial equity and education, because that was one of the big areas they funded into. When we funded education, it was much more higher ed. It was not necessarily the lower levels of education, but we all had a love and had a very particular focus on arts. And that evolved too. We started out funding kind of very traditionally in the arts. Then we started funding much more into women in the arts and women's stories being told in the arts. And then we just really kind of came into that intersection of racial justice and social justice in the arts. And that was really a fun learning opportunity about what's happening out there. We went to different conferences about it, and it was really evolving at that time about what does this mean? Who is doing this? And just some amazing, artists, individual and groups. Clyde Valentine was a perfect example of, before he came to SMU, the work that he was doing. And so we see arts as a way to really shift the conversation and broaden and depth, the depth that you can go to in the arts and still, be focused in these areas.
Well, and that's the
arts thing in there.
yes, no, absolutely. I don't think people really understand how just tied together it all is. And I think I personally have attended, things that you all, workshops and trainings that you have funded, and Quo has as well, that you all have hosted. And I can tell you that even for me, that after a couple of those sessions, I said, this will forever change how I do my work. Like, I was already headed here, but this sealed it. It sort of informed the way I wanted to do my work, even as an arts education and as an artist. Anyway, Quo can tell, we had the conversation about that. I said, there's no turning back.
Yeah, there's no going back.
There's no going
back. There is no pretending like we did not have this experience.
Yes.
And there's no pretending like there's any other way to do this work. And when we say this work, it's all of it. There's no other way to engage with other individuals, other organizations. There's no other way to do it. And it was in response to several of the sessions that we've all experienced together. What I love about what you just shared is that both you and Lauren, and I've seen it, I've experienced, I've been in it with it, have the personal commitment to it. And it's not so much as, we have this foundation here, have this money, go do something. As much as it is, we're here with everyone, learning together. And then, as you say, there's always something that's going to knock all of us back. All of us, every single person, because we're all affected by this systemic racism and by the other systems that prevent individuals and groups from being able to actually have access to progress and having access to resources. And so none of us are experts. We know some things. We're all human.
Yeah.
And then just having that experience and that dedication and going forward in the work, as well as supporting the work and being a part of the work. So absolutely.
You're saying that, but it's a tricky thing, I will say, because I always have to remind myself and Lauren sometimes is, people, when you come into the circle with other grantees, they always know a funder's in the room. So we have to be aware of the power structure. And even though this is the water we swim around in, that we can lose sight of what that power means to other people. And if it cuts down on their ability to really lean in to the racial healing work or other things that we have done, then, we need to question whether we need to be there or not. We want to be there because we love all these folks and we learn so much from them, but we don't want to be the barrier to them being able to experience fully. And, in some of these things, there's a lot of vulnerability that's asked, and trust has to be built very quickly sometimes. And so, I'm sure some folks are like, I don't know that I want to share this because then I might have to have a conversation with you about a grant later. And how's that going to be? Which I get, I totally get that. But I will say too, because you had Jerry Hawkins on your show, that the very first training we did through Dallas Faces Race, we did specifically with the arts and culture organizations. And one of the reasons for that was one of the early conversations that Race Forward had. They kind of came and scoped the landscape, so to speak, before we started all this forum. And they said, it really seems like the arts and culture organizations are kind of leaning into this a bit more. So maybe the first training is you start with them and then you move to the other groups. So we did that. And Jerry Hawkins reached out to me. I did not know him. And he said, I've heard you're doing this training and I want to be a part of it. And I said, well, who are you with? And he was with the Wilkinson Center. And we funded the Wilkinson Center before. And I said, well, Jerry, we're going to have these other training sessions. And there's going to be one for education nonprofits, educational nonprofits, and you know, social services. And so I think maybe you'd be better suited to, you know. And he said, I have an arts background. I do arts. I mean, he talked about, you know, he wanted to be in the first one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in he comes with the big book. Have you ever seen Jerry come in with the big book that's like History of Dallas, the redlining? And he would, you know, he was flipping open that book, and he had a fire in his belly. But the other reason I bring that up is I don't remember whether Dallas Opera was in that group or not. They might have been.
Not that I know of.
Not to my knowledge.
Not to my knowledge either.
But the thing to remember is that even those that were there, it's a continuum. It's a journey that has to start. It has to be endorsed. You have, again, same deal. You have to stick with it.
Yeah.
Because you know, now with Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, and some of these other organizations are really starting to do, as you all are, doing this work internally. And even though that was our intention when we started those trainings, it took a long time.
Yes, come on.
So that's the reason why that investment has to be, you know, if it can be done this way, is to really invest in these organizations, but also hold them accountable, doing the work themselves. So I want to pitch something real quick. The next iteration of North Texas Cares grants are going to open up in maybe next week or sometime in August, and 2.0. And we didn't participate in the first one for a variety of reasons, not because we don't think it's hugely important. But one of the things that attracted us is this time, the categories are much more explicit. There's an entire category for social justice. There are embedded in a lot of those other categories, racial equity, racial justice, education. I'm telling you, I have never seen this before in this community. And it means that philanthropy is growing and moving and learning, and that is hugely important, as well as the nonprofit community. So hopefully that synergy and that energy is going to continue, and we're going to see a lot more transitions start happening and transformation.
Amen. There is definitely a shift. Yes. We too have witnessed and seen. We too have observed.
Even in that, I love that you focus kind of on the arts, or that you shared the focus on the arts, because there's still a lot of arts organizations. Dallas Opera is doing the work. We started the work, I think, last year or so, doing the work. There are a lot of organizations that are still not getting it. It's not clicking just yet. And it's important that we understand, as arts organizations, as you said, we have the ability to cultivate these conversations, to create this shift. We can't do that if we don't acknowledge the own issues, the sexism, the racism, the oppression, the phobias that we have within our own art forms and within our own organizations. We are not exempt. And so I think it's beautiful that you shared that. And even in the way that the shift is happening and how philanthropy is also being a part of that shift, that role of, or that question of who am I? What is the role of this organization? What is the role of this foundation? There are some organizations we know are just kind of trying to make sure they tweak just enough to qualify.
That check box.
Yeah.
Yes.
We know we can't fake it. This is not something you can fake.
That's right.
No, it's to quote Melissa Young, it just is.
It just,
You know, she said it just is.
People are now, and they are asking these questions, rightfully so.
Yes.
What's going on behind those closed doors?
Yes.
And representation is huge. You have to have representation on your board, in your leadership roles, in your key leadership roles, of BIPOC community members, and a lot of that, a lot of that whole structure around boards and how boards are created is a barrier, because you're expected to bring a certain amount of cachet and dollars sometimes to these board roles, and that has to be rethought. There has to be, if you're going to have representation, you're going to need to really revise these very old and traditional ways of establishing boards and board governance and all of that. And so in that new grant for the North Texas Cares 2.0, they are asking specific data, demographic information. We've been doing that for a while. But we'd ask, are you a member of Dallas Faces Race? What is your board makeup? What does it look like? And if they, if it came out a certain way, then we have the ability to go and say, let's talk about that. What are you doing? What support do you need to make that shift? It's not to be punitive. It's not to say, although at some point, if they don't make any change, then, you can kind of say, we're going to work with those who want to work with us.
That's it. I was waiting for it.
That wasn't we didn't make that up. That was Race Forward in their consulting practices, and we were starting the forum of Dallas Faces Race and doing this. And, we had 300 partners, but they were not 300 partners that were actively, participating in doing the work. Doing the hard work, to really taking those steps. And even when they said they were, they ran into barriers too, because of their board members and because of their senior leadership, that, they weren't in those rooms. They were not going through those trainings themselves. It was their staff members. Well, staff members, they get it. They know. So it's really important that, you look at, and so maybe 50, if we were lucky, we're really, starting to move forward in that regard. But by asking those pertinent questions on a grant application is important. And it's not just, let's just see if they filled in the blanks. It's, let's have a conversation about what you need to be doing and how can we help.
I love that. I absolutely love that, because a lot of times there are people who just flat don't know. Right. And so they really don't know. And unless there's some sort of guidance, then you don't get the funding, and you're kind of sort of left out, like, I didn't get any feedback. I didn't, you know what I mean? So I think that's phenomenal. All those things, I also think there's merit to, after if they've not borne any fruit, at least the fruit that is being looked for, which is this grant, then there's merit to saying, I don't think you're really taking this seriously. This is not a priority for you. And you have to move on. You have to go work with people who want to work with you. And that is the motto to end all mottos. And I say that because one of the questions that we get, particularly around this topic and this conversation, people say, well, we want to work with everybody. We want to draw people in. And I remember at one of the sessions that you all hosted, I remember someone saying, well, there are people who don't get this and don't even want to talk about this, or don't want to even deal with this. And I remember that being your response. Go find the people who do. Yeah. Work with them instead. And basically don't beat your head up against the wall. Go where, and you never know, that person that didn't want to work with you before may be influenced by what you did with somebody else. Exactly. But the point is that you'll waste a lot of time and resources and energy trying to get to somebody who has said that they had no interest in one way or the other. And you can be working with somebody else. So I think I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think a lot of our times, particularly those of us who work in this kind of work, this work that's the heart work. We want to see the heart change so much. Yes. And we want to educate and to that point, and we want to that compassion and that want to, and that drive that we have to right wrongs and to dismantle and replace systems that do not serve the whole of us. You know, when we see somebody that doesn't want to do it, we're just like, oh. So I think that there's something to that. I also think there's, you know, something to tighten in the purse strings because unfortunately we live in a capitalistic society, right. And so that dollar makes people holler.
That's right.
True.
And
you know,
traditionally, we know that Black-led organizations, and particularly Black women-led organizations, are so underfunded. And you know, it's like we sort of, you know, you hear a lot about, you know, they know how to, you know, make hay out of nothing and that kind of thing. And it's sort of like that's a positive thing to say. And it's like, why are we penalizing them? They should be getting more money because they know how to do this. But again, you have to expand your awareness to understand those kinds of things, because some funders will look at, well, let's look at their budget, and they're only a budget size this size, so they will grant accordingly. And yet, you know, there's a lot of different ways to kind of shift that power zone. Like, if you're going to do a collective and there's a smaller group, then why not, you know, fund them to actually kind of hold the reins? You know,
you shared a lot about your, you know, some of the experiences you've had and just the way that you have engaged in this work from many, many different perspectives, because it's not just about the philanthropic part of it. It's about the communal part of it. It's about the heart part of it. It's about all of these different things that feed into the way you do the work. And I think that is so incredibly important. And I think what I want to ask is, what is some advice that you can give to other organizations who are seeking to do this kind of work, to other philanthropists who are looking to try to fund this kind of work, or looking for a reason to fund this kind of work?
Well, to philanthropists, I would say, first off, if they're willing to gather representatives or community members of color and say, what do y'all need? Where's the pain? What do you think? You know, tell us about, you know, your experience. Tell us some more about what's happening, because there's no way we have access to a lot of this information. And anything you do really needs to come from what the needs are. I mean, Ruby Sales always talked about, go and ask them, you know, where the pain is, and be willing to hear what they are saying to you.
Yes.
Now, sometimes, you know, because the organization has established, these are our funding guidelines and these are the pillars that we fund under, but those things are not written in stone. I mean, it's just that we were lucky and we had leadership, and they said, we want to have racial equity as part of our, one of our funding strategies. But that doesn't mean you can't go to the board and say, you know, or board members say, I think we really need to shift, you know, what we're doing and how we're doing, and to really challenge that status quo. Because, I mean, you have to see where we're at now. There's such incredible opportunity. There's the windows of opportunity are opening, and strategically that doesn't happen that often. And funders are uniquely positioned to be able to step through and help to really shore up some there's powerful need out there. There's incredible organizing, and there are leaders that are very unsung in a lot of this work, but find out who they are and follow their leads, I would say nonprofit organizations, you know, staff members still can, you know, hopefully be consistent and insistent that this is important, and to, you know, you want to look at your own house first, and you know, certain levels talk to each other. You know, board members will talk to each other. The senior executives will talk to each other. So I would say, if there's an organization that says, you know, I really want my senior leadership to get on board, look around and see who is doing the work, and see if you cannot connect up those conversations. And it's the same way with funders can help do that. They can help make those connections, and you know, help to kind of facilitate some of those introductions and those meetings. I would say, you know, join Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, for goodness sake. Be a partner in that work. We are funding that work. That was the transition from Dallas Faces Race to Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation. And that partnership came about serendipitously, but it's because we also asked. We had the conversation with Dr. Gail Christopher and her program officer, and we said, we started this work and we've reached this point and we don't have the money to continue it on our own. We don't know what to do. And as it turned out, and again, that was a connection that Race Forward got for us to have that conversation with the Kellogg Foundation. They were doing the work, they were looking to launch it. And then, you know, we know, literally, it was I think it was the week after the police shootings that we already had that conversation scheduled. So it just accelerated everything. And that's going to be our legacy work in this area, because we're sunsetting by 2022. That means we will run out of money. We're giving it all away. Yeah. That's another thing funders can really think about. Right. Is what does longevity really give you? I mean, right now you can do important work. So either just, you know, really look at your funding percentages and kick those up, and who you're funding, and really go and look for new opportunities out there. And also consider that, you know, maybe you can give away more money and make yourself, you know, and then allow others to come in and take your place, because holding on and hoarding to dollars is crippling our society. We've seen the results of this, and it didn't just happen in the last election. It has been going on for a long time. Yes. One of my grantees said to me one time, she said, philanthropy is a patriarchal, and it is racist. It's misogynist and it's racist at its roots. So philanthropy needs to change too, right along with everybody else. We're doing what we can until we.
That's fantastic. So this is the part where we begin to wrap things up, because I believe that, and Quo probably feels me, but I think you have given a lot to think about. Absolutely. I think you have given a lot of things to think about. I think you have you're going to stir a lot of conversations, which is good, because it needs to happen. There are conversations already happening. There's already a shift happening. But I think this might be a little boost, a little extra boost, because these are things that need to be said, and you're seeing this in real time. And I think this is huge. So, Quo, I always go to Quo, Diane, this is where we go to our positive notes, about all this, because again, I do know folks, and I've heard it said even in the field of thinking about, philanthropy. I've heard people say, this is tough. This is going to be hard. This is daunting. How do we change a system that what are we going to do? And so I always ask Quo at the end of each show, what's the good part about all of this? What are the positive notes? What are the things that we can think on those days where it may seem daunting, but that'll help us push through and progress forward?
I say positive notes is that we have beautiful examples before us. We have examples of ways that we can consider taking things into our own. It's not so much as always following a blueprint as much as it is centering what matters, and then being able to follow that in a way that acknowledges the humanity of others, in a way that acknowledges the humanity of self. That is both the beautiful things about us, which also includes the things that are not so great. And in that, there's a certain honesty and there's a certain freedom that comes with that honesty. And yes, we are all suffering from this. Yes, we all have to change the way that we're doing things. So as organizations, as individuals are looking to support, also do the work, do the internal work with self, do the internal work with organization, because otherwise, again, we just become more efficient at sustaining the system, and that's not what we're wanting. Yes.
So that's the end of our show today, folks. You know, we hope you learned something. We hope that if you didn't, you'll ask. You know, we're always open to it. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you all again next week. Peace.